Hello there. Welcome back to season 4 of Empathetic Educators. I'm your host, Naomi Toland, and I am very excited to have Dr. Richard Ivry on the show today because, I've been getting so nerdy with all these takeaways from his book. So I'm really excited to bring him onto the show today. And let's get ourselves started with our intro. Hello, welcome back. And I am just so excited to be here because we've been trying to get, like we know, every week we get nerdy. We look at neuroscience, empathy, relationships, design thinking, and psychology. And we actually have our guest on today talking about neuroscience and psychology, which is absolutely fantastic. But before we start, I'm just going to recap on what season 4 is all about. So like we know, we're looking at the systems of our bodies, systems of schools, so what happens in the curriculum, looking at culture, so how we can set up systems of people around us, and just how that we can bring that in with creativity as well. So that's kind of the things we'll be touching on throughout the show and throughout season 4 too. So I think without further ado, I'm going to bring our guest on the show today, and our guest is Richard Ivry. Hello.
Hello.
How are you today?
Very good. It's a beautiful afternoon here in California, and the sun's just starting to come across the bay.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much. And I'm so excited to have you here because, like I said, whenever I was in New Zealand, which we have a common thing, I was listening to one of your podcasts, and you actually lived in New Zealand as well for 6 months, which is fabulous. And so whenever I was there, I was attending some lectures in the University of Auckland, and it was so great to come across this book because the way you've written it, it obviously is very technical and very neuroscience, but you've really written it in a way that really brings it to life, but also understandable for people like me who have never really had a neuroscience background. So thank you so much for writing that. But I'd like to give a little background to yourself and just let the audience know who you are and a bit about you.
Sure. I actually found a great new use of the textbook during COVID. You know how they taught us how to get the camera at the right height for Zoom calls here, and it turned out I have one copy of each of the 5 editions of the textbook. This is what got me to the right height here.
Perfect.
Anyhow, it's a pleasure to be joining you today. So about myself, I grew up on the East Coast. I'm from Connecticut, and I traveled around the country a little bit, sort of between my college years, and actually love brought me out to the West Coast in pursuit of a woman who's now my wife, and that ended up in graduate school in Oregon at a very opportune time when the Cognitive Neuroscience revolution was just taking hold, and Oregon happened to be one of the ground zero places of that revolution. And so I was in a really nice spot for doing graduate studies. And after graduate school, I moved out to California. I first was a faculty member at the University of California, Santa Barbara, which is a beautiful town. You almost felt like you were retired at age 30. Santa Barbara, such a paradise there. But I was there for a few years, picked up a couple of children along the way, and then moved up a few hundred miles north to Berkeley, UC Berkeley, where I've been since 1991 now, so about 30 years. Seems like it's flown by.
That's so cool. And like the whole background to it, like you say, like me looking more into neuroscience and looking into cognitive neuroscience, like I said, I'm very like a little baby in this sphere. I'm only coming onto it and understanding it. But it's so crazy to think that it's only really been the past like 40 years, 50 years that we've really, really understood like the ins and outs of that side of it. It's so cool that you've been part of that journey. Like that, it's so cool.
Yeah, it's not to say we understood. It's probably overstatement. Yeah. It's more actually. I think a new scientific field is actually defined when different methodologies come together. So there's always, of course, been a great deal of interest in kind of relating, the brain to behavior. The classic way of doing it was behavioral neurology, where people would talk about things like, the left hemisphere is dominant for language. How do we know that? We see that people, for many hundreds of years, have damage to the left side of the brain. It affects their language functions. And it was really the merging of kind of the methods of cognitive psychology with the methods of neuroscience, and get people to think about, that there's other ways that we can approach the question about looking at the relationship of brain behavior. And that's sort of why we call it kind of this cognitive neuroscience revolution. It's not like it was something completely new, but it was a marriage of different methods, kind of brought a level of sophistication, I think, to the science that wasn't there before.
It's so cool to be part of your journey as well. So we have some people coming on actually from, we say, someone says, hashtag West Coast is the best coast, Shannon says. So she's coming in from there as well. And we also have Debbie Ferguson coming in too and saying hi, Shannon, and hi to the team. So it's really good to have some people on board who are listening and joining in with the conversation as well. So yeah, and we have Steph Rothstein too. As a Bay Area person who graduated from UC Berkeley here in Richard Ivry. Go Bears. So that's really great to have some people coming in from your space as well. So I think we'll get ourselves started. And a really big part of this Empathetic Educators and getting nerdy is understanding the brain so that we can help ourselves take action with ourselves too. And so we start off with doing a little bit of a breathing bubble from Erica Sandstrom, because we know that keeping ourselves with our breathing help with our regulation. So we're going to put that on the screen just for a little 30 seconds, just so we can all get in the same space and get in the same area no matter where we are in the world. So I'm just going to put this little video on. Just give this a little bit of time for yourself. If you're watching or if you're listening, just a little minute of just a little bit of a breath. Hope you enjoy. I just love that. It gives me in like a really good like space whenever I'm doing my breathing, and I think it really does change my actual space. So this is kind of like more of a personal question and more of a space for obviously you being here. But whenever I was in my first year of teaching, I only started to get migraines, and so it really did change the way I was processing. And they said it was because I wasn't breathing properly. And it's just crazy to me how much our breathing, those simple acts of something we just take for granted, it just changes your whole body. So like whenever I notice myself getting heightened or notice myself getting more and more up, I do take myself back and do more of my breathing techniques. And it's so crazy. Could you give like a little bit of like an insight into that? Like obviously knowing the neuroscience and things like that with it. What's your kind of takeaways from that?
Well, I mean, we like to think of ourselves as thinking beings, but we are not thinking beings. We are thinking, acting beings, and our brains, really exist to make our bodies operate in a more efficient way. A lot of the way we think about, as we think about higher level cognition, I think the kind of nice model people have is that, the most essential things we actually don't have a great deal of mental control over, right? They're happening automatically, like locomotion. It's almost wired into our spinal cords, and breathing is kind of wired into the most primitive parts of the brain. And the rest of the brain is kind of giving us that great flexibility. It allows you to take those building blocks and do all sorts of wonderful, creative, more complex actions and interactions with the world. But they still have to be built on those very fundamental motor behaviors such as breathing. And so there might be a cost having to think about an action. You forget to breathe almost because it's sort of one integrated system. And so trying to bring those things into harmony, I'm sure is very beneficial. Skilled athletes teach you that all the time. I mean, even something like, I think one of the essential things of training, there's great studies about skilled sharpshooters with the rifle and how their control of breathing was maybe the best predictor of who became an expert marksman.
I think again, it's such a great thing to be aware of, and I think the more we can be aware of it and bring it into the classroom. So I use that little breathing bubble, and actually, people who are watching and listening, it is Erica Stanstrom who's creating that in her space for #MyBreathingBubble. But you can actually download it. So I put the little link into the bio below, so you can actually find that down there to bring it into your space as well. So I think we'll get started with some of the questions. And Debbie's saying, "I love neuroscience," while she's listening. So I think it's really exciting to have you on and giving your insights in this space as well. So thank you, Richard, for coming on. I think the first question that I'm interested in from reading this book was the idea of this quote really, really stuck out to me. The portions of the brain's attention networks affected by ADHD have only recently begun to be identified. And that's what I'm really enjoying doing with this book, is understanding different parts of the brain and what they're for and how they're connected. And I think the big thing I'm taking away from it is that it's all connected. I think, like you say, years and years and years ago, it used to be that maybe like one area was controlling this and that was the only area, but now it's actually that they're all networks coming together. So what has recent research taught us about brain functions such as attention, and how could we use that to create engaging lessons and bring that into our actual classrooms? So yeah, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, okay, great question. Yes, so certainly we've moved a long way from the notion that there's a spot in the brain that controls attention. Classically, we might call that what was the phrase, the homunculus problem. The homunculus referred to the idea that there's like a little person in the head that's kind of controlling the focus of attention, kind of holding the spotlight and moving it about. And we certainly do move our attention about, but I think the more modern perspective is to think about it emerging from a network of different areas, such as you see in that picture, and so forth. And they might be a network, might be thought of as, one part of the brain is maybe trying to kind of maintain attention, and another part is trying to maybe move attention to another location, right? Because we constant tension between, do I continue to attend to something or do I change my focus of attention? And I think that, attention is sort of that interaction of that tension between focusing and shifting. One of the more, I think, important concepts, one that wasn't in the first editions of the textbook, but has emerged in the later editions you'll see, is this notion of two sort of general attentional streams. One they call the dorsal stream, and dorsal means upper. So it'd primarily be things like the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe. And then the other one would be the ventral stream. Ventral is always lower than dorsal, so that would be kind of more the temporal lobe and frontal lobe. And that these are sort of reflecting two prominent ways we think about orienting attention, right? One way we orient attention is sort of, we might call it top-down or goal-driven attention, right? Whereas the other one is more like stimulus-driven or bottom-up attention. And to give an example, maybe relating one to the classroom, I think about suppose you're a teacher and you're trying to, you've called on a particular student and you're trying to focus in on that particular student, right? That's, this student hasn't been participating, I'm going to call on them. That's top-down attention, right? I've got this goal, I'm going to try to hone in on Susie right now and get her to focus and give me an answer about the reading lesson we're engaged in, right? That's your top-down control. I've got this goal. I really want to engage Susie right now. But at the same time, lots of other stuff's happening in the classroom, and maybe a little Herman over on the side there, he's like fidgeting or gotten out of his chair or doing some distracting thing. That's the bottom-up aspect of attention, right? That's stimulus-driven, that, your mind's constantly monitoring the world, and you've got this focus on what you want to try to achieve, but at the same time, you've got to be ready to shift your attention when the situation demands it. And that's sort of that interplay. The endogenous is, where do I want to direct my attention? The exogenous is, what in the outside world requires my attention? Now, of course, we don't usually talk about that in terms of the classroom. We kind of give the example of, I have to, I always have my focus of attention, what I'm attending to, but some, dangerous beast might be suddenly appearing from the side, and I've got to be prepared to shift my focus of attention. That's sort of when we think about how these systems evolved, we tend to think of it that way. It's sort of this ability to focus, but at the same time, be willing to have a flexible attention system.
I think like that it goes back to the reason why I'm so interested in neuroscience is like I think the more that we can understand it, the more that we can have empathy for our learners and then act upon that. Because like you said, like you summarized the classroom very nicely. We're trying to get the attention of the kids, but there's so much else going on that will get them distracted and get them involved in something else. And I think it's just really good to know that like those two systems are operating, those two systems are in play. But I think like even going deeper into like the goal-driven system and the stimulus system, like is there one over the other that can get more attention? Like, no, like obviously we are like either goal driven or stimulus driven, but it would seem to me if it's like stimulus driven is going to protect you, then that's going to be what's going to distract you. Would you get distracted more or goal driven more, if that makes sense?
Well, I mean, of course, we've all had the experience that we're so focused on something, we're oblivious to everything that's happening around us. My youngest son, when he's working and he's staring at the computer screen, you can walk through the room and say something to him, and about 3 minutes later, he's going to say, "Oh, what did you say?" Okay. But no, I think you're right. I think the system is probably biased towards the stimulus-driven side of things because, you know, we have our goals. We're focused. You know, you have your teaching plan when you come into the classroom, but sometimes the situation demands that you have to be flexible, right? The context, you know, really might override, you know, you've got your goal, your plan, teaching plan for the day, but you've got to be flexible and prepared for something else. And so I do think there is probably a bias that we can't help in most situations to, you know, not be captured by those unusual things that come into the scene, right? So
Yeah.
it's good, right? You hear a loud sound or you hear your name or something like that, and you can't help but be distracted there. Of course, you know, that's what, you know, I think, you know, probably computer games are really good at, right? You know, like how do they capture your attention, right? Advertisers are constantly thinking about how do we capture attention, and they know that, you know, our attentional systems can be penetrated pretty easily. And so you put a bright flash, a bright change in color or moving something, and we can't help but look at it.
Yeah, I think that kind of helps because I think like Shannon asked the question of how do educators balance that issue? Is it possible to give a top-down attention to both groups? So I think like that kind of like makes me think about like with the stimulus end of it, if we can kind of like help our learners like grab their attention, get them engaged through that stimulus approach, but also give them goals towards it as well. It's like trying to weave the two together. Is that what it is? Or is it kind of like, yeah.
Yeah, well, certainly that would be ideal. I mean, Shannon asked a really fundamental question there, which is, can you divide your focus of attention, right? I think she was asking, you know, if I've got two kids that I got to keep an eye on, can I really divide my attention between the two? And that's a tricky question that still isn't a really good answer to. I tend to think that we aren't really all that good at dividing our attention between two different things. What we've become good at is rapidly shifting our attention between the two things. And this comes up with, you know, the term multitasking all the time, right? Do we get really great at doing two things at once, or do we really get good at flipping our attention back and forth between things? And so I'm not sure. I mean, you know, there's the classic work on people who have the so-called split brain procedure. This was done to treat people with epilepsy, where they would separate the neural connections between the left and right hemisphere. Sounds horrible, right? But it was a really, really effective way to treat epilepsy in people who didn't respond to medication. And it provided a really interesting way to test some scientific ideas about the unity of consciousness, because we know that the right hemisphere, right side of the brain, is kind of tracking what's happening in the left side of space. And the left side of the brain is tracking what's happening in the right side of the space. If you separate the two hemispheres, can you now independently track something in the left side and something in the right side simultaneously? And it does look like people who have that procedure become better at dividing their attention than you or I when we have when the two hemispheres are communicating with each other. So in this very rare condition, you actually gain this ability to divide your attention quite well. But it also means that in the, you know, neurotypical brain, we don't really have that ability. You know, the two sides maybe compete with each other. The right side of the brain saying, hey, is anything interesting over on the left side? anything is shown with the right side, but at some point that competition gets resolved and our attention tends to be much more in a unitary way. There's only really, the same way our conscious experience is telling us that we're really only kind of aware of one thing at a time in some sense, but we can become very good at rapidly shifting our attentional focus.
So we can't actually go and get our brains all split. So that we'll have to try and work it out. That we're able to try and.
I know there are certain advantages. In our own research, we studied that the classic problem: can you rub your belly and pat your head at the same time? And that's of course challenging to all of us. But again, you take these individuals who have the two halves of the brain separated, and no problem whatsoever. They can do that.
And I think that that's what we're trying to do, obviously, in the education sphere. I think, like Keisha said, is this is why rituals and routines will create a soothing atmosphere so the brain can relax and learn, versus for the saber to tiger mode. So it's creating those routines. So like we said, little takeaways that we can bring into the classrooms. For me understand this and trying to bring it into my classroom, I've been trying to create the routines and create space, but also
Dog invasion. Dog
invasion. Oh, we love dogs here. We love to have dog on board. And I think that that kind of does tie in with that idea of how can we set up so that yes, they are distractions, but also embracing those distractions and embracing creating little spaces for routines, but also sparking that imagination, because that's what's kind of coming away in my head is the glittery and the fun is what engages the learners, because they're what's going on over here, but also those routines are really important so that they're on task for that space too. It's it's the and of that approach.
Yeah, so I'm right. So like for instance with Keisha's question here, hope I say your name right.
Yeah,
right. I mean I think a lot of mindfulness training is kind of tuned into that notion about it is about controlling attention, right? With the idea that let's try to get rid of all the sort of distractions and the fluff there, but it also, in a sense, is a practice that the end goal is to actually make you more attentive, right? To be better tuned into what's happening. And so quieting all the background chatter and all the distractions actually can make you attend better. And of course, I'm sure that is really important in an educational setting.
I think just going back before we move on to the next question, it's oh, the dog wants to come in again. It's fine. It's no problem at all.
It's a double dog invasion is the problem. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I'm jealous that you have dogs. That's why I miss my dogs from back home. Huh?
You need a pandemic dog.
I know those cuddles. And I think going back into this space of the portions of the brain attention networks affected by ADHD have only recently begun to be identified in that space, because obviously we have in the mainstream system more working in special educational needs and that kind of space. I think for me this is where my care and my want to know more about this is coming from as well, because I was working in the Senko team back in my old school. And is there any takeaways that we can have towards learners who have those diverse needs within the classroom? Is there any new things that are coming up even now that you've learned about that space, or
Well, I don't have any great prescriptions here. Right. ADHD continues to be kind of a mystery, right? When you think about the at least the most common pharmacological treatment is backwards in a sense, right? Because the Ritalin and those sorts of drugs are stimulants, and you think that seems opposite what we.
Oh, they're having.
I promise we do call it the dog that needs to be exorcised sometimes when it makes the package squeal. But yeah, so again, it's really in some sense a paradoxical effect here about why would someone you think is distracted and hyperactive, what's counterintuitively about giving a medication that would be thought of as more of a stimulant seems like the backwards way to go there. So again, I think the real lesson is about finding the right balance point between, say different attentional networks, the top down versus the bottom up, about finding that right balance is, I think, what the real challenge is, that we can't think about it's a switch that I'm more attentive or I'm not more attentive, but it's really the balance between different attentional systems is sort of where we're trying to direct things, and where we'll find
Yeah.
say,
And it's exciting space, like you say, like you don't know it yet because like it is just this is where it is, kind of trying to find out more about that space. But hopefully it's an exciting space to hopefully help learners and educators like try and learn more about what's going on in there, instead of just being like obviously the empathy part of it. Like we had a boy on last year, and he had autism, and he was talking about how his whole journey was all he wanted to do was be understood and not judged. And I think that's what like the aim is like the more we can understand about the brain, the less we're judging them. It's more trying to see how can we support them in that space. Hopefully we'll learn more and more in that space too about the ADHD.
Yeah, there's a classic principle in psychology, and now we kind of know more about the whole neurochemical basis of it, but it's this notion about there's an optimal state of arousal. So if we think about a continuum from no arousal, sleeping or in a coma, to super arousal, right? There's an optimal level of performance as you move across that function. That as you go from, say, sleep to aroused, your performance is going to get better and better. But at some point, you're going to go too far. You fall off the cliff, right? Now, you get more aroused, your performance gets impacted, right? You're too cranked up, you're anxious, you're unable to learn. And so, again, for each person, where that function peaks is going to vary from one individual to another. And it's really trying to optimize, where do I get you in the most optimal attentive state that maximizes your performance? That's sort of the challenge. And that's the thing that's certainly going to vary from individual to individual. And that whole function might look different in, say, something like ADHD.
Yeah, and that's where it is. The teachers, we are trying to balance it all, and we're trying to understand it all. And like you say, it's every single kid is all different needs and all different wants. So it's trying to get the whole.
I'm sure you've had cases where you've got your class engaged in a lesson and everything's going great, and you're just feeling really good about it. And then you crank up the excitement level too much, and suddenly things go off, right? And you're kind of going over that optimal function point there.
Yeah, and then you'd be like, oh well, we can't do this if we're not going to be able to bring ourselves back, but they're just already there, and it's hard to bring them back to you in that space too. So yeah, and I think like it kind of ties in, because I think we've learned a lot about the adolescent brain. So it's trying to be it is becoming, and I think I have a session with Nathan Wallace, and he talks about, who's a doctor in New Zealand, and he talks about the fact that the brain is shut down for renovations during that time of like adolescence, and so, just before we move on to the next question, does that affect these attention centers in that space, so we can have more empathy for those teenagers and going through what they're going through?
Without a doubt. So, when I talked about the dorsal and ventral attention networks, in both cases, I had the frontal lobe in there, right? One was that goal-oriented one was frontal parietal. The, stimulus-driven was frontal temporal, and so forth. The frontals in both of those, right? Ventral frontal, but also prefrontal. And it's clear that, that's one part of the brain that is maturing at a slower pace than the rest of the brain. We always talk about it, we make jokes about it. We say, he's acting without a frontal lobe, or, oh, my child, misbehaved because he doesn't have a frontal lobe yet. It's clear that, again, that is really important for regulatory control, for doing something that requires long-term planning to kind of damp down our kind of impulsive behavior, our desires to have something immediately, right? A lot of goal-oriented behavior requires a lot of patience, right? Imagine most of you have heard about the marshmallow test, right? And the marshmallow test is really about inhibitory control, and the frontal lobes are very much about, asserting inhibitory control. If I want to accomplish the goal of doing well in school, I've got to suppress the immediate desire to go out and run around in the afternoon and do my homework, something like that. But I don't want to, make it be a one-way street about, we're getting better over time by having a mature frontal lobe. I think there's a lot of really interesting work going on. Some of it by my colleague Alison Gopnik, which is making the case about, well, okay, yes, it's true the frontal lobes mature later, but why might that be? Maybe there's an evolutionary advantage to having a slow maturing frontal lobe. she's thought about that, and her answer, and others have the same sort of idea, is that by not having a mature frontal lobe actually kind of increases your willingness to take risks, to try to maximize the learning in the sense of being open to new situations. And because once you have that control there, now you're kind of thinking, all right, here's the appropriate behavior in the situation. But that, in a sense, could be suppressing creativity to some degree. And so maybe we really want adolescents and children to have kind of a poorly formed frontal lobe. It's really the best way to make them creative learners in the long run. And so there's probably always a advantage, not just think about disadvantages and think of this as a one-way street to some optimal level of cognition, but it's probably really important. We can't be born with the genetics saying, having coded all the information. What we've really got is great learning devices up there. And it may well be that, in these early years, we want to maximize the openness of the mind. And, once we get to reproductive ages, now we want to have a more controlled and maybe evolution doesn't really care about being quite as exploratory. Now the mission from an evolutionary perspective is, how do I keep my children, fed and clothed and warm and all that?
It's so interesting. I was actually as part of my blog series I'm going to be releasing in a couple of weeks. I've been looking at my journey throughout the different spaces and different chapters of my life so far, and me even thinking about, because when I went to America at age 20, and then it literally was like flipping a switch, between me being that age and then going in my first year of teaching, my brain almost changed. Is there a part? I know it's all different for all different people in all different spaces. You mature differently, and your brain changes differently. But is there a point where, I know it won't be as clear cut, but where your brain is fully formed and when it's not? That kind of the talk again.
Well, there's in many parts of the brain, at least structurally, it is a downhill slide from the day you're born, in the sense that we don't really create many new neurons, and so we're slowly losing neurons. That is at one level of analysis. At the other hand, it's not so much how many neurons you have, but the connections between different nerve cells. That's important. And that's always getting shaped by experience and getting stronger and so forth. So there isn't a critical point, but there is this tension between being open-minded and creative and willing to take risks and explore new things versus kind of the more controlled, let's choose the best option. There is kind of a real interesting transition point, and it actually maybe comes about in adolescence. And I've always been struck by this one finding by a group of researchers at University College London. And they basically, they're studying a very atypical population. They're studying kids who become sociopaths. And they do these long-term developmental studies. So kids are going to engage in really severe asocial types of behavior. And it's somewhat discouraging to know that many of these kids are showing signs of this type of behavior even at age 6 months or 3, at 1 year old. You can see that they're already acting out in ways, and that's going to be kind of persistent if you follow. And that's what they've done. They've painstakingly observed these kids, every few years from age 6 months through now into their 30s. And they can see this very consistent personality, this kind of asocial personality. They always kind of stand out in the group, but they don't stand out in one time during the developmental lifespan. And that's during the period of adolescence. That's because so many other individuals start to engage in behaviors that can get labeled asocial, so that small group of 1 or 2%, they kind of get lost in the shuffle there, or lost in the noise, because 15 to 20% of other kids are now actually also engaging in these sorts of asocial behaviors. Now, those kids, they're having their wild teenage periods and then they back down and so forth. But it does say something about that, in adolescence, I think it's, arising from the brain and sort of this whole drive about expressing your independence, being able to be a self-learner and so forth, that really blossoms during those adolescent periods. You've kind of got some basic mental skills, and now you're ready to explore either in thought or in action. Sometimes explorations don't lead to good places, like they can lead to very bad places, like you steal a car. But nonetheless, it's sort of a manifestation of this sort of openness of the mind. There's a period there in development in adolescence where I think there is sort of this general stronger pressure to be sort of open and exploratory and looking for new possibilities. And that eventually, I think, as the frontal lobes mature and so forth, you have more experience, that sort of gets suppressed a little bit. And there's probably some cost about it. You don't think about the world as creatively as you did as an adolescent. You know, when you're a 30 or 40-year-old, you kind of are a little bit locked in your thought patterns. And so, you know, of course, we want to really take advantage of those periods of exploration and maximal creativity. And one other point on that is that there are some, you know, wonderful experiments where people do these, you know, brain twisters, these problem-solving problems. I talk about this a little bit in the textbook, where, you know, puzzles that you and I might have great difficulty doing, people have had frontal lobe strokes, okay? So strokes that have destroyed parts of their brain that are, you know, thought to be the highest points of cognition. They're much better at solving these problems than you or I at, because again, they become more creative. They can look at problems in from a variety of perspectives. And, you know, maybe that's a very extreme case of someone having a neurological accident, like a stroke, that now is thinking again with the kind of mindset of an adolescent or a pre-adolescent.
And you're trying to like understand it more, like where it's going to. That it's so cool. It's definitely really helpful for like trying to understand the adolescent teenagers, but also like understand how we can try and bring that creativity in as adults. Because I think that's what I'm trying to think of, like as like a teacher. Obviously, we are trying to approach learners in their space and meet them where they are, but then our brain is like almost like more structured. So it's trying to make our brains more fun again. Like that's what I've really about learning this. Is like, how can we do it?
Well, that is that even has a name to it now. It's a term I hear people use is called cognitive enhancement. In the same way we might take vitamins or, you know, protein shakes or something for physical enhancement. People look for ways to do cognitive enhancement, and so and that can range, you know, there's many behavioral interventions people do, right? They say, you know, keep your mind active, do crossword puzzles, or, you know, join trivia contests and things like that. Or there might be certainly something very common in the San Francisco Bay Area. There's a lot of startup companies that are doing computer games that are cognitive enhancement. And, you know, there's this whole work on asking what types of computer games are boosting cognition as opposed to which ones aren't doing much except mindlessly keeping you entertained or something. There's no literature, I don't, you know, and somewhat controversial, but very intriguing and interesting about that action video games are actually really good at boosting attention. To swing back to our attention question, again, it may not be focused attention. It might be more about attention, more of that bottom-up attention, because be prepared for the enemy that's going to suddenly spring up from the corner of the game. But you can go on the market now. You can buy all these sorts of cognitive boosting computer games. The more extreme version now, but again, there's quite a few startup companies in San Francisco pursuing this route, is what we call non-invasive brain stimulation. Okay, these are very safe methods. They sound really scary, right? It's going to be either an electrical device or a magnetic device that's going to perturb brain activity, okay? It's going to maybe make neurons more excitable. So if you put a low electrical current on the skull, it's going to pass through and it actually changes the likelihood that the brain cells are going to fire. And there's a lot of research saying that you can actually facilitate learning by using these sorts of non-invasive brain stimulation methods in a safe way. Now, a lot of it's being used as a way to study, as a basic research tool, right? If I perturb the parietal lobe versus the frontal lobe, how does that affect my attentional function, to keep up with the attention theme? But as soon as, you know, basic research discovers that, oh, you know, if I do parietal stimulation, people can learn a foreign language faster, you know, immediately there's someone who wants to commercialize that and say, oh, if we can, you know, sell these things very cheap, people at night can go and do their studies. They put on this device afterwards. It boosts up the brain a little bit and it consolidates the learning experience better. Sounds like science fiction, but it really, there's some scientific validity to that. I don't know whether it justifies, the $300 you'd spend. I don't know if the effects are really that substantial or lasting, but it's a very active area of taking ideas from the lab and bringing them out to,
And I think for me, it's like, obviously as a teacher, we're not going to be bringing that into the classroom and stimulating the brains of the kids. But yes. That's the thing, is like, it's actually like, where is the world going to be going to? Do you know, like you say, we're not now, but like, where is the world going to be going to? And I think for me, it is a bit scary. That's a bit like, it's a bit crazy, and it's a bit like, it's like, what could that possibly be? But I think for me, I'm actually really interested in finding out about this, because if that is where the world's going to, how can we understand it more to like make sure that we are being empathetic and having ethics and understanding it for like what it looks like, rather than to get it done to us and it just happening and it's all around us, like the mobile phone space. Like, people used to say, I'll never have a mobile phone, and now everyone has one. Like, well, most majority of people have one. So it's like, how can we understand it to actually take control of it and understand it for ourselves, not getting done to us? Because I think like Keisha said as well, like as a teacher, like it's not just like the fancy bang fanciness answer, because like that's obviously like what we know does work, but how can we implement that into our classrooms, like creating a sense of community, creating like that chemical feel good combo for children, but actually not in the sense of just that space too, because it's like it's the and approach. Because for me, I'm interested in it because it could be our future, but also it's like, how can we as teachers take control of that in that space and create those chemical feel good feels for our kids, but also not just in like the digital space as well. Yeah
no, I mean, I'm certainly not advocating that
I know
be equipped with these non-invasive brain stimulation devices. I mean, I tend to be conservative on that front and think that evolution has probably found the right balance for how fast you could learn, and right, you don't want to play with Mother Nature. You might get what you wish for there in some sense, or get what you didn't wish. Think you open Pandora's box, right? And yeah, I mean, right, we all see the examples of the internet that seemed like they were going to be the great tools for promoting this open, free access to information, and now we can certainly see some of the dark side of things like that. So I'm sure that's true here. On the other hand, if you look at human society, basically, the record is that if you think there's something that's going to give you an advantage, privileged people are going to take advantage of that. They're going to, whether it's, training in an essay, SATs are an American test, to get into college, they're going to take advantage of that. I mean, so there are people who, at least, we know, I think some very thoughtful scientists who, kind of created a field called neuroethics, where they're at least, let's get ahead of the game here a little bit and at least be thinking about this. We have to recognize that, even if we think this wouldn't be a good direction to go, we have to recognize that, there are always these societal pressures that might introduce things, and let's try to just be as thoughtful as we can in thinking about it, and at least providing guidelines, as much as we can to be not just sort of reactive, but be proactive here. And so, we'll see this. I mean, right, there's a common phrase in California about, we're moving to the beyond human world, right? That there'll be that synchronicity point where, our digital devices are going to, in a sense, have changed what it means to be like a human mind, right? The interaction of ourselves with our machines is going to have created a whole, evolved into a whole different kind of almost species here. Those are kind of feel like science fiction things, but it's certainly the kinds of things that you want people to be thinking about and being aware of, and considering all the pitfalls and challenges there.
Yeah, I just having the conversation. Like, that's what I like about it, and what I'm enjoying, like, finding out about it is like, what does it mean and what could it mean, like the pros and the cons with it. And so yeah, thank you. Like, I think you're answering loads of questions, and you're answering, like, we're like kind of like going between all the different spaces. So it is an exciting space, but it also is a what could happen here space, like you say, the human error and the but it is good to know, like, there's like the neural ethics part of it is like people are trying to at least understand it, like, so then we don't just go too far, because like you say, Mother Nature is trying trying to understand it too. I think going like the next question, it kind of does like relate into like our brains as well. So like what they were seeing was that simply observing or imagining the action was all it took to activate some of the same premotor cells. And I think for me, like this idea of mirror neurons, it really helped. I've kind of looking into it a while for my education space. And so like what role do mirror neurons play, and how could knowing about them help scaffold and learning experiences? So maybe give a little insight into mirror neurons, because like I said, I'm only new in the neuroscience space. Maybe give a little insight into that and then what they actually mean for us.
Yeah. So it's a catchy term, right? Mirror
Yes.
neuron. And by mirror, it means that it's a part of the neuron, right? Of course, is one of the cells of the brain. All the brain cells are neurons. And these, usually we think about there's perceptual parts of the brain and motor parts of the brain, language parts, but, the mirror neurons are kind of like an interface, because mirroring means that they're active both when I'm producing an action and when I'm observing someone else produce the action. So in the classic experiments, they might train, if they might be doing this with an animal model, they'll see the animal, that neuron becomes active when the animal reaches, but it also becomes active if the experimenter comes in and reaches for the cup. And so that's where the term mirror neuron comes from. That it has both the perceptual and the motor sensitivity there. And, at first it was kind of an interesting way to think about, the linkage between how you go from perceiving to acting, right? A child, right, learns a lot through observation. And this might be, certainly a important way for observational learning to occur. I observe you producing this gesture, and I can then produce it myself. But then it really took on a life of its own when people thought about, well, actually, maybe this is also really important for how we understand other people's minds. Because not only do I observe your action, but maybe this is a way I can sort of understand the intent of your action. And so that's where a lot of great excitement about mirror neurons was, that maybe this is a way to think about how we, some very fundamental human things about empathy, right? Empathy means that I have to understand why you're doing what you're doing, okay? Many cases I might not approve, but usually, if I can understand why you're doing something, then I appreciate it better, right? It doesn't look like some strange gesture, but now I understand the intent there. And so people saw that, maybe the mirror neurons was going to be a nice way, a way to think about, the social brain, not just sort of thinking about, can I explain how I can produce a movement, but also can I understand why you do the things you do? And that there was this, and so there was really great excitement. Now, it's probably not raging the same way it was 15 years ago. It's like any field has its fashions, things wax and wane, different ideas. It doesn't mean that the mirror neuron idea has gone off. I think it's just that the explanatory power, people probably have a more modest view. It was sort of, the notion like, if I've discovered sort of the neurons that are important for understanding social cognition and empathy, maybe now I have some new insight into understanding, say, something like autism. Like maybe people with autism don't have a well-developed mirror neuron network. Maybe I have some new insight or some new explanatory power for understanding what's not, what's functioning in an atypical manner in an individual with autism. Maybe I can now have this hypothesis that it's related to, say, an underdeveloped mirror neuron network. So that's when there was, I think, a quote around 2005 by a wonderful scientist named Ramachandran, who said something like, mirror neurons will be for neuroscience what DNA was for molecular biology. I think he caught up in the excitement and thought that mirror neurons were going to be kind of the key to understanding not how the brain works, but how the social brain, the essence of, human cognition and so forth. I think, as research gone on, I think people have realized that, something like autism is a much more complex syndrome, and there isn't going to be a simple explanation like, abnormal activity within the mirror neuron network. But it doesn't mean that, there isn't value in those sorts of ideas for understanding, something like social cognition.
Mm. I think I think it goes back to the idea of like it's all connected as well. So like there is so many spaces that they are all connected to each other. I think like that mirror neuron for me, it was really good for like that observational side of it, like how I can help my learners. Like so if I'm doing one space and then what's activating in their brain to like help them understand what they're seeing from me, but also what they're seeing from other learners. So learning that space from the relationship side of it, going back to what like Keisha and Debbie are saying, is that relationship piece and what you're showing to them and what they're seeing in their environment is actually really, really like it can create really positive things, but also quite negative things too. From that, like from what they're seeing in that space. I think that's what my big takeaway from that space is with the mirror neurons. It's like what they're seeing, what they're observing. It
Yeah.
does bring things into their brain too. Yeah.
Okay, so and that also actually it wraps back to your breathing bubbles, if that was
Yeah.
your phrase. I mean, because another important part, I think, of the mirror neuron, you know, insights that we take away from it is it also help bring the focus back to what we call embodied cognition. This notion that,
Mm,
you know, if we want to understand how we think and learn, we don't want to think about it as this abstract entity. We have to
mm,
recognize our brains are really evolved to allow our actions, for us to be able to interact in the world in a more efficient manner, right?
mm,
As our actions and the mirror neurons representing that interface between the kind of perceptual thinking side and the acting side also helped really emphasize that, all aspects of thinking, there are always intimate links between perception and action, between thought and action. And so I
mm.
think the mirror neuron, that whole legacy of it is also that it was really important in helping bring the body back into the study of the brain.
Mm. Yeah, so like actually like understanding that the whole body is part of the whole process as well. Yeah. It's
Yeah,
yeah.
and that within that, learning, right? I mean, learning to recognize that this is a cup and it's something I can drink out of. I can actually do some of that learning not only by you telling me about it, but by my interacting with it is also building up that knowledge. That much
Mm,
of the knowledge we accumulate is by interacting with the world, by acting, by being actors in the world. And I think the mirror neuron notions also reinforce that idea about providing kind of a neural theory about, the intimate play between controlling the body and building up the mind.
No, it's just so cool. I think for me, it's like it's just so cool to like learn about all the different spaces and all those different things. I think like was one little last takeaway from the space is what is like your kind of what do you think one of your favorite things that you've learned? I think you've mentioned a few, but one of your favorite things you learned from research and the journey that you've been on that could help us grow good foundations for learning as well. Like what's one of your favorite things that you've learned?
um, well, in my own personal work, I tend to be downplay complicated things and fancy technologies. I tend to really like to focus on fairly simple behaviors because I think you can frequently, by studying fairly simple behaviors, gain some insight into elementary processes, and then you can
Mm,
think about how they can actually then be used to build up into more complex operations. So I think it's always, part of that is then also appreciating that the brain didn't really evolve to solve complex problems, but it
mm,
probably evolved in a much more of a hodgepodge way. There was no master plan to like
mm,
create, brains that could solve calculus or, do advanced social policy, but rather we really evolved to solve probably very simple problems. And to do that, we probably had many different ways to learn. And really what we see now when we see complex behaviors is sort of this hodgepodge of many different systems that evolve to solve very specific problems are now being exploited or come together to solve more complex problems. But
mm,
nonetheless, they still reflect their evolutionary roots. And that is that, they probably have very particular specializations and there's no single learning system, but
mm,
there's many different learning systems that are operating together. And this is something that we do in our own research right now. We're very interested in how people learn to make simple movements in varied environments.
mm,
And even a very simple task like that, if I, again, to take my favorite example, reaching for this cup, when I reach for that cup wearing my nice short sleeve shirt because it's a nice warm day, compared to if I put on a heavy jacket now because it's a cold day,
Mm.
when I reach for that cup, I have to actually have a very different motor plan there because the weight of the thing there, and the brain's evolving to like solve that problem. It's always constantly calibrating itself, the motor system. But to do something even like that, I think, you know, a theme in our research recently is that that's also actually involving, even a simple process like that involves many different learning systems that are operating in a parallel way, that are operating at the same time. And, you know, we can try to do clever experiments in the lab to like separate that and show that even a simple task like that is actually using a variety of different learning processes, and then take those sorts of ideas and think about how they're also extend to learning more complex tasks. But that's something that comes up in the, you know, in my world, in the studying human performance, but it also comes up in the memory world, that there's no single memory, single learning system. There's many, many different learning systems. And the behavior we observe is actually the integrated output of all those learning systems operating kind of in parallel with one another.
So they're all working, like, again, going back to like that network side of it, they're all working together as well. Yeah.
Well, they're not always working together. If we do, you know, some of the funnest experiments is when we set up situations where they actually work at odds with each other, and we can get very weird people to produce very weird behavior if you set up the right context where you put the systems in conflict with one another. Now, usually each one's trying to solve the same problem, and so they do converge, but it doesn't mean they're working together. They could be all working independently, but trying to achieve the same goal. And in the laboratory, we set up situations where solving the same goal, they may be solving different goals, and we can see that they actually aren't working together so well. They're each working on their own.
Ah, okay. So they're all connected.
There's not always a master plan.
So like they're always like, yeah, that's cool. That's actually really cool. I think, but it goes back to the idea of it's tricky. Like as teachers for me at the minute, like it's, yes, we can understand this more, we can understand it, but like just like you saying, like every single brain is individual and every single space is individual. So they're trying to understand all those little humans that we're trying to help, and then it's like trying to understand that all those brains are all working in different spaces too. It's tricky, but as long as we keep trying to learn about this and trying to weave it together, it's a task that we're trying to make.
Well, and that as you said, there's lots of individual brains out there, but each of those individual brains is composed of maybe 25 different learning systems and 10 different attention systems, and so again, yes, a very complex system. So it keeps us in business.
Yep. Keeps us trying to learn it. No, thank you so much. And I think I'll probably come away from here just having way more questions as well about like what the different spaces are too. So I think it's great to have your insights in this book, especially, is really helping me in that space too. So yeah, thank you so much for letting us know about your space and what you're learning about. I think just at the end of the show as well, just to let us know a bit about your personal side of it too, where you are in the world. And we've had a couple people on the show from your side of the world. So maybe just let us know a bit about you and where you like to visit.
Yeah, well, I shared these 3 pictures. You said, you know, tell me about my world, and this is my happy place. It's an island off of Massachusetts called Martha's Vineyard, and this is a very far tip of the island where my family has a cottage that my father and his sister got in like 1967, and I have not missed a summer there. No matter what, I find a way to get there for a few weeks at least each year. And so that 69 picture is about our second year at the place. And then 95 is when my own kids were starting to fall in love with the place. And then even last year in the pandemic, I drove across the country to get there. I didn't drive across the country really to go to there. I took advantage of the fact that I was driving across the country to meet my first grandchild. But I did throw in a 2-week stay on Martha's Vineyard there to get my annual dose. So yeah, that's 3 snapshots across my life, but with the continuity of the same very happy place.
Thank you so much for sharing it. It looked like a beautiful, beautiful beach. I love it. Love going to the beach. I think everyone will be happy to be able to do their free travel and hopefully pretty soon. So yeah, it's definitely great to have you on the show and like be able to share all those different perspectives as well. So thank you so much for coming on and letting us know a bit more about the brain.
All right.
And like I said, I think I'm excited about it, but also I'm a bit like what's going to happen with this, with like all the different future technologies and things like that. So it's excited, but also questioning more and more about what's the potential for the future.
Yeah, no, keep an eye. The buzzword to keep an eye on are things like brain-machine interfaces, right? Where we, and lots of good clinical applications there, but also as we've talked about, interesting to see about other ways that these things get exploited, whether for good or for bad.
No, it's a exciting, crazy place, but I'm excited to be part of the journey as well. So thank you so much for coming on, Richard, and letting us know about your space. And we have people just saying thank you as well. So Debbie said thank you so much for your insights, and people who are joining in the conversation too. So if you're joining in live, thank you so much for your questions. And I think people like me as well, they're like, what's going on here? What does this mean? And it's good to have those conversations and bring you into the show and have this chat together. So we're going to continue looking at this space for our nerdy neuroscience and just find out more and more. So thank you so much for coming on. And if you're joining in live, thank you for joining. But if you're not, then let us know about what your thoughts were for #empathetic_educators. And you can find out more about this book that I have on the space. And I put the link in the bottom as well to let you know too. So thank you so much for coming on. And thank you so much for your insights, Richard.
It's my pleasure.
Bye, team. Bye.